Right. So in this chapter, we are going to again discuss on economic capital, but more importantly on economic capital frameworks. What kind of frameworks are used to, calculate economic capital? How do you validate it? What are the challenges? What are the best practices? Everything. Right. So let's just go through the learning objectives. First is within economic capital implementation framework, describe the challenges that appear, right, in calculating the economic capital. It could be defining and calculating risk measures, risk aggregation, validation of models. All these concepts very clearly we are going to do within the whole chapter, right? And then we will also look into, counterparty credit risk, IRBB modeling, right? All these. Then we will go through the recommendations by BIS that the supervisors should consider in order to make use of effective use of internal models, right? Internal risk measures. Economic capital is one such risk, internal risk measure, right? Third is explain the benefits and impacts of using an economic capital framework within the following areas: how it impacts in credit portfolio management, risk based pricing, customer profitability, all these. Lastly, we will talk about is best practices and key concerns. One way to, like this is a lengthy chapter, okay, if you go through your book. So I would suggest first you read these learning objectives and then go through the chapter. It will be easier to make things in a perspective. So yeah, this slide just now we have done it in our last chapter, that what is economic capital. It lies somewhere between your expected capital and the extreme tail, the confidence level that you choose for your calculations, right? So the economic capital is nothing but your unexpected loss. Like the calculation you do for unexpected loss, you try to observe that unexpected loss using your economic capital. Basically that's the buffer you keep aside, right? So next is economic capital process. How do you go about economic capital? First, you identify capital, measure it, aggregate it, and allocate it. As in identifying, like the finding the risks in each activity and exposure. Because unless you find the risk, how will you measure it and how will you keep a capital provision for it, right? Next is you measure the risk, like quantify which how much risk is there, how much capital you need, all these. Thirdly is you aggregate it. For different activities you have measured the risk, but now you need to aggregate that risk to one capital number, right? And lastly you will allocate, that is attribute capital back to businesses where your budgeting kind of things come to picture, that for this particular activity I want to allocate this much capital based on the risk and reward purpose. And as they say here is aggregation and validation are the hardest part. We have already discussed an example of aggregation in the last chapter, right? We are going to discuss more on this in this chapter itself. Now there are six challenge areas, right, in calculating economic capital, or about the economic capital full framework, right? First is the risk measure, which measure capital captures the risk well, and is it coherent. Now when you say, so let's go back a little. When you calculate your economic capital, you all agree it comes from your measures like VAR and expected shortfall, right? Are we guys aligned on that? Anyone?
Yeah, yeah, no problem. Correct, correct. Yeah.
Right? So we are all aligned that economic capital is based on the measures like VAR, expected shortfall, standard deviations, etc. Correct? So what
99.9% VAR, we have to, banks have to hold economic capital for the big banks, definitely.
exactly. So basically, economic capital is based on some risk measure. That risk measure is VAR, right? There are other risk measures as well. Expected shortfall is one example because it is more sophisticated than your VAR, right? I think you must have already done expected shortfall, all the calculations. Even we did it in credit risk book, right? So these are risk measures. First challenge is which risk measure do you use to calculate your economic capital, and secondly you have to make sure that risk capital is coherent. Definition of coherent we will do within this chapter, right? That is first challenge. Second challenge is, now you have chosen the risk measure. You are now you have to aggregate the economic capital. How do you do that? What is the aggregation methodology you use? Do you sum it all? Do you assume perfect correlation, right? Do you use zero correlation? And even if you want to calculate an exact number, so it was a big range, right? 550 585 to 900 crores, the last chapter that we had seen. It was a big range between which you had to have a economic capital. But how do you reach that number? Should it be 700, 600, 650? How do you do that? On what basis do you aggregate it, right? Third is, now you have measured it, you have aggregated it, but you have done it both based on some models, right? So you have to validate if that model itself is correct, right? We again, in within operations risk, we have studied how does model validation work, right? So all those model validation concepts you have to apply on that economic capital frameworks as well, correct? Fourth is your dependency modeling. How correlated are credit losses across the borrowers? Now, this is also related to your risk aggregation. Along with that, like when you are, talking particularly about credit losses, right? So where we talk about high correlation, where everyone try kind of goes under together. How do you incorporate that in your economic capital model? That's one kind of complexity that you have to incorporate in your economic capital, right? Guys, I hope you understand all, you are able to relate all these challenges to economic capital. If you are not able to, please highlight, and I'll be happy to explain more on that, correct? Fifth is counterparty risk. Now you have talked about different borrowers being correlated. You have to also talk about the counterparty risk and the wrong way risk within this, right? Like when there is a stress situation, how would your counterparty risk work? What kind of how do you incorporate wrong way risk calculations within your economic capital model? And lastly, interest rate risk in your banking book. As you guided one of you already had highlighted that it's difficult to talk about IRBB in banking book portfolio, because that portfolio itself is of long term horizon. So it's the calculations become complex to make, right? So all these challenges is what we are kind of trying to sort out within this chapter. First is risk measures. Let's talk about risk measures. And as I've told you, there are different risk measures. There is standard deviation, VAR, ES, expected shortfall, and some there are other risk measures which are called, what coherent risk measures. That is just one second. Yeah, spectral and distorted risk measures, right? That's also there. So these are different risk measures. When you talk about the risk measure, what are the properties that you would look for in the risk measure? First is that risk measure intuitive, right? Intuitive, is everyone able to understand this or think about it, right? Like if I'm when all of us, even learning the FRM and everything, when someone talks about the risk, the first thing that we come up with is VAR, correct? That calculate VAR, think about VAR, we do all of that. So that's a intuitive risk measure, right? It's a sensible notion of risk, such as one part of it is in unexpected loss, right? That what is expected loss, what is unexpected loss, all these are kind of where your notion from risk derives. Second is stable. That obviously you will use a a measure, that's fine, but that risk measure has to be stable, right? It can't keep on swinging here and there because of small changes, right? If that happens, because small changes are very prominent in practical scenario, in practical company perspective or economic scenario perspective. So if your if your risk measure is always changing, you won't be able to calculate capital based on that, right? That means every day you are changing your capital as well. One day 5 crore, next day 10 crore, other day 50 crore. It can't happen like that, right? Small changes are fine, but it can't be changing big time. So that's why there has to be stability. Third is easy to compute and easy for senior management to understand. That's the ultimate part, right? You use all kind of sophisticated models, but if nobody is able to understand that sophisticated model, nobody is able to use that sophisticated model, basically you are doing harm to yourself, right? Because if you are not able to justify things, how, there is no reliability on those things, right? There is where do you bring the reliability from? Lastly, it allows the simple, meaningful decomposition into business lines. That is, you are able to take your business decisions based on these risk measures, because these can't be two separate things. One way you have your risk, one way, other way you have your business decision. The agenda is that you look at both and you kind of mingle the both. That's when you will have a comprehensive view of your whole firm. If your risk is going one way, your business decisions are going other way, there is no there is no use spending on the whole risk management and the whole unit of it, right? So when you talk about your risk measures, they say these risk measures should have four coherence axioms. Coherence means like your risk measures have to be coherent. That is, they have to follow these four things. First is called monotonicity. That is, a portfolio is always worth more, is that is worth more is always less risky. The monotonicity property means is that if you have a portfolio that's you know 100 crore and the other portfolio that is 80 crore, because you that is always worth yeah, because your other portfolio is worth 100 crore, it should be less risky. Okay, that's the whole notion that it goes by, like whichever has more money should be less risky, is what are trying to say. Second is subadditivity. Combined risk is at most the sum of the parts. That is, if you combine portfolio X and portfolio Y, the combined risk of X plus Y should not be greater than the sum of individual risk of X and Y. Are you guys able to understand this?
Yes.
Great. Yeah. Third is your positive homogeneity. That is, scale the portfolio, scale the risk. That is. Next is translation invariance. That's fine. Just give me 1 second. Um, basically, positive homogeneity means is as the size of the portfolio is increasing, your risk will also increase by the same level. For example, you have a portfolio, let's say, which is worth 100, okay, and it has a risk of worth 20. Just assume, right? Now if I multiply the portfolio with 5, 100 with 5, that is, now I scale the portfolio 5 times, that is 500 is the portfolio. Then your risk should also be scaled by 5, that is 20 into 5. You understand, right? Like, it's relative. If you are scaling one thing, your risk will also scale in the same proportion. Got it? Lastly is the translation invariance, that is, adding risk-free cash reduces the measure. That is, if a portfolio, within a portfolio, I add risk-free, some risk-free investment, you can say, or maybe cash. Like you have $100 within that 100 portfolio, I add $20 of cash, because that cash is risk free. There is no risk associated with that. The value of the cash will go up, go down, like that, right? So it will reduce your absolute risk ultimately, right? So these are basically four, the and this coherent risk measures are very important, right? You must remember that these are the four coherent risk measures, coherent properties that a risk measure should have. Got it? Like you look into this coherence in the in terms of your VAR, expected shortfall, all those things you try to see that if your risk measure is coherent or not. Basically, does it follow all four properties or not? Got it? So now that's what the table they have given, comparing different properties. First is the proper, how does each of this risk measure does in terms of all the properties of a proper risk measure, right? First is intuitive. Standard deviation as a risk measure is fairly intuitive. We all know that, right? If you have a high variance, high standard deviation, we consider it to be risky portfolio, right? So everyone kind of understands it, and it's very intuitive as a risk measure. Where you want to talk about a risk measure, you will pick standard deviation as one, right? We are also intuitive. Expected shortfall, fairly intuitive, but not the, as the top one, you can say. Spectral and distorted risk measures are not intuitive. Do you guys understand the spectral and distorted risk measures?
Mm, I don't really.
Okay. So, this is important one. Again, I think in one of the chapters only you will learn. Spectral and distorted. Okay, before we talk about spectral and distorted risk measures, you understand expected shortfall, correct?
Yes.
Right? What is expected shortfall is we calculate VAR, and after the VAR we choose a limit that the losses beyond VAR we take an average of those losses. Correct? Are we aligned?
Yes.
Yes.
Right? So now that we have taken an average, that means we have assumed each of those risks after the VAR is equally weighted, right?
Yes.
But now that weightage example is what brings out your spectral and distorted risk measure. That's why I have highlighted so much on expected shortfall. In your expected shortfall, because you assume everything has equal weightage above and beyond VAR, every loss has equal weightage. What your spectral and distorted risk measures do is they say no, they are not, they should not be equally weighted. They should
Yeah,
also
you
be
are right.
weighted as
Expected,
per their.
you are right, because expected shortfall is the weighted average of the losses worse than the VAR cutoff, right? It's a weighted average.
Right. Yeah.
While that
But
weighted average assumption is lust in spectral, right? It's lust.
sorry.
The weighted average assumption is no longer there in spectral. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, that assumption
Okay.
is no longer valid. That's where you use spectral and distorted measures, where it says the weightage should not be equal. It should also be based on the risk. It those. The average you take, you do not make it equally weighted, but you make it risk weighted. Is it clear now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that's what they say, this is not intuitive. The spectral and distorted measures, these are not the first things that you think about as a risk measure, right? Though this is considered to be the most sophisticated one. All
Yeah,
right.
both distorted and expected shortfall are called meaningful. Decomposition meaningful. So, but they're both meaningful, basically.
Right. So next is your stability. In terms of stability, standard deviation depends on all of these actually depend on distribution. So if the way your distribution works, because you calculate it on based on distribution, right? Standard deviation also, like is it more peaked or not? Same with your BAR, expected shortfall. So that's like if your distribution only is such that too broad, then these measures will also kind of rely on the same thing. Third is coherence, right? A most important property. So which risk measure is the coherent one? First is standard deviation. This is not coherent because it does not follow the property of monotonicity. What is monotonicity? That is a portfolio that is always worth more is less risky. More standard deviation does not go with the same notion. Okay. Second is your VAR, that it does not you must remember that VAR does not follow the property of sub additivity, right? That is, if you add two portfolios, if you sum sum the risk of two portfolios separately and you combine the portfolios, right, the total sum should not be greater than the individual sums, right? Total
Of
risk
course,
should not be.
of course, we learn that expected shortfall is meeting the requirement of sub-additivity. We have learned that
Yeah,
already.
when the expected shortfall as a concept was introduced in your books, that's when we had discussed that because VAR does not follow the property of subadditivity, that's why we need another measure called expected shortfall. Next is spectral and distorted measures. Both of these, they follow all the properties of coherence: monotonicity, subadditivity, positive homogeneity, and translation invariance. Okay. Fourth is decomposition. How these measures look like, you can say. Standard deviation, simple and weak, right? Very simple measure, but it is also a weak one, not much reliable, right? VAR, this can also distort because it does not follow subadditivity, right? Expected shortfall is a meaningful measure, and so is your spectral and distorted measures, because in these two measures we have taken care of what was going wrong in previous ones. Used in practice, standard deviation has a limited use. VAR is the most commonly used. Even though you have expected shortfall, till date banks mainly use VAR, not the expected shortfall. ES is rising, right? People are still looking into it. Spectral is rare. It's more of an academic study as of now, but it's very difficult to use spectral risk measures in your practical scenarios, because how do you do the weighting? How do you incorporate that weighting? Is a weightage is still under discussion, right? So, why aggregation is hard? We have come to the same question that we had discussed in our last chapter. Last chapter just was a view of it, like, overview it. And now we are talking about the actual problems, right? So there, they say there are three things have to be harmonized. First is metric. That is, do the measures satisfy subadditivity? Again, the coherence part, right? Second is confidence level. Different risks uses different intervals, right? First you have to bring it all to the same interval, like your credit risk and market risk, right? Credit risk is over 1 year horizon, market risk is over 1 day horizon or 10-day horizon. So how do you bring it all to the same level and then aggregate it? Third is your time horizon. Sorry, confidence level is not time horizon. It's about at what confidence do you calculate it, right? 99, like each, when you aggregate each of the risk, then their confidence level also have to be same, right? You can't say this is calculated at 95 and other is calculated at 99. That would be wrong, right? So these are three problems while aggregating any risk measures, right? Next is diversification is not guaranteed. That is, combining portfolios does not always lower risk per unit. Ideally it should, right? Ideally the combined portfolio should have the lower risk, but they say it is not always true. Second is VR can be larger than the sum of its parts. This is again the property of subadditivity, right? Lastly, covariance misses the non-linear and tail dependency. If you look at standard deviation and covariance, variance, covariance, they do not do well with non-linearity and tail dependence. This is all your distribution, basically based on distribution. So wrong way interactions can make the total higher, not lower. These are the things you have to take care while aggregating the portfolios. So five aggregation methods are there that we have. First is simple summation. Simple summation is what we had done in the last chapter, where you simply sum everything. You say like sum everything. That's your most conservative number. because that gives you the upper bound. Whatever you calculate afterwards is low, will be lower than the simple summation. It won't be higher than simple summation. So that's why it is simple. That's the advantage, and is very conservative. You can easily use it. There is no the only problem with it, with that will be the opportunity cost, but otherwise there will be no harm using a simple summation, right? Disadvantage is it ignores diversification. That's where your opportunity cost comes into picture, right?
Actually,
And
Twinkle, you're right. This chapter, I think we will have to memorize. This is so much theory. This chapter we'll have to memorize for sure.
you have to memorize it. More than that, you have to try to relate with it with each and every concept that you have learned. That's all. If you remember all other books, this is very easy to remember, I would say. Okay, because this is all intuition based. But yet again, how your intuition works could be very different, how other people's work. So yeah, you can try to memorize it, but at the same time I would ask you to understand it a little bit. At least that's why I'm trying to give you relate everything for you guys, so that you don't look at it as a standalone thing, but you are able to relate it with bigger scheme of things. Okay. So yeah, we were at the simple summation. So disadvantages, it ignores diversification benefit. That's where we had 900 crore as a value, because it was ignoring this diversification. It was assuming perfect correlation for everything, and it also assumes equal weighting. Like whatever the risk, you just equal weight everything, right? Then comes your constant diversification as an aggregation method, where you assume that if, you assume a constant diversification. For example, in this case only, let's say we had three this thing, right? Market, credit, and operational risk. Let's say I assume that I don't assume a perfect correlation, I don't assume a no correlation. Let's say I assume everything as a correlation of zero point 0.5. That's a fixed diversification, right? Not properly correlated, not uncorrelated. That's where I have a middle number, right? Middle number in the sense I had 585 to 900 crore as a range. That's when with the constant diversification I have got a middle ground. So you are not using this number here, like you are not keeping the high capital, because there is opportunity cost here. But you are also not keeping the lowest capital, because you don't want like you want to be safe somehow. That's why you assume a constant diversification benefit, right? Next is variance covariance. That's another way of aggregating, is that you recognize pairwise diversification. That within these two, as one of you said, like within these two, market and credit, they might be, they might have a correlation of one, uh, right? Credit market and sorry credit and operational might have a correlation of zero point 0.8, and market and operational might have a correlation of zero point 0.5, right? So this is your pairwise correlation. Now your aggregation has come down to 847. Understood?
Twinkle, if you're showing Excel, we don't see it.
Oh, sorry, let me share again. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, now do you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
So earlier what I had done is, in this example itself, what I had done is I had included everything as zero point 0.5. That is your constant diversification, right? That's where your 741 number is coming out. Got it? Now,
Yes.
if when they say variance covariance, you assume a pairwise diversification benefit. Let's say you assume, everything, like these things are pairwise correlation of market and credit is say one, one. Pairwise correlation of credit and operational is zero point 0.8, and pairwise correlation of market and operational is zero point 0.5, right? That's what you assume. Now this is your updated number. So see, idea is not the calculation here. Nobody is expecting you to do these calculations. I'm just showing it only for a understanding purpose, so that you are able to relate. Now you see, this was your lower bound, correct? After that lower bound, when I try to make some calculations, I try to basically, when I try to use different methods, all these methods is what we are using, right? One number could be this, right? More sophisticated number could be this, right? Most conservative number is 900. The only, like, why I'm trying to show it to you is, when you're remembering these methods, you are able to relate it to this example, that how things, like, why are we doing so many methods, what's the point of doing so many methods? Because it gives you, that's where your it's the whole capital that you have to keep, that's the numbers you have to work around, and this is something like, you have to actually arrange this money to keep with the regulator. Got it? So in variance covariance, what is the disadvantage? That the correlations are hard to estimate and misses non-linearity. Now I have just assumed these correlations, but who has given me these correlations and who has calculated these correlations? That's difficult. Correct. Fourth point is copula. Now copula function also, you guys have done it, okay? But you might not remember. I'll just give you an overview. What copula does is,
Yeah, actually, Twinkle, this slide is so very important to me because even with covariance, we cannot capture non-linearity. We cannot capture fat tails. That's why the copulas are coming in, right? To capture the fat tails and the linearity, non-linearity.
uh, uh, yeah, basically
Exactly.
what copula captures is, copula also captures the correlation between two
Yes.
variables, but it is
Yes.
again a more sophisticated way of capturing that dependency between
Yeah.
the
Fat tails are
variables.
captured. Fat tails are captured by
Yeah,
copula, but not by traditional variance covariance. Exactly.
right. So when you like, for your you don't need to, do much about copula. You just understand what copula means. It just is a way of capturing the dependency, capturing the correlations, right? So what they say is, advantage of copula is because it is sophisticated, right? More flexible, captures non-linear tail, everything is hunky dory, but it is very hard to parameterize and validate. You have used a complex model, fine, but how do you validate that model? How do you make the calculations, right? So that's a that's about copulas. Lastly is a full simulation. You do a complete simulation of everything. You try to include every possible calculation, right? Like this, within this range itself, I'll say, okay, these two what if the correlations vary this much? What if let's say this how do I do it? Like, here we have used a limited calculation, right? Only three pairs, and within three pairs we have taken constant correlations, right? But in full simulation, you further break down this formula and try to do everything together. That would be most accurate, because you have tried to include every possible scenario, right? But it will have huge data and IT load. How do you process all that data, right? How do you bring it all together and make a number out of it? And does it really make sense for you to spend so much money? Because, like, rather than spending so much money on that full simulation, you will rather keep the whole 900 conservative number only, right? Wouldn't that be better, rather than making so much complex calculations, keeping spending so much on IT and etc., because there is a cost associated with calculating everything, right? So yes, this is intuitive, that's, yes, this is most accurate, but does this really make sense? And there could things could go wrong in this complete simulation as well. So it will be a false sense of accuracy. You would feel like this is accurate, because of the complexity, there will be things that you will be doing wrong. So not really, recommended to use that,
Yeah.
right?
This Twinkle, this full simulation means that Monte Carlo simulation, right? Same thing, right?
Yeah, 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 you can say that.
Exactly.
Yes. So these are your aggregation methods, and we have learned why what is the problem of different aggregation methods, right? Now validating the models, you have see how you learn go about this chapter is, first we discussed about risk measures, correct? That what are different risk measures. Then we discussed about what could be the possible problems with each of these risk measures, right? So how do you pick the best risk measure for your situation, right? Third we did was that yes, you have the risk measures, but you have to, for your complete comprehensive calculation, you have to aggregate as well, right? How the aggregation works. Now you have calculated, you have aggregated. If I relate it with this slide, you have chosen the risk measure, correct? You have met the first challenge, you have also met the second challenge of aggregation, right? Now we are discussing about the third challenge, that is your validation. uh Okay. Now validation works as same as what we had done in your last operational risk chapters, that someone has to be independent, they have to have the full knowledge, all those things. But within economic capital, how does it work is, what validation does is it gives you the confidence that model assumptions are appropriate, right? Because someone independent and someone knowledgeable is actually validating the whole thing, they are reading the documents, they are trying to make the calculations, everything, right? So it gives you confidence. Second, it is a way to identify where the model breaks down, where the assumptions are going wrong maybe, or where the coding is not working, right? So it is strong for risk sensitivity and weak for absolute accuracy. Still, validation does not mean it's a absolutely accurate model, right? Now why economic capital validation is hard. See, you in this chapter you treat economic capital calculation as one model that you are going through, right? Now within the context of economic capital frameworks, in economic capital models, why is validation again a big thing, right? First is output is a full distribution, not a forecast. Here, if you use different models, your output is a full distribution, right? Even when we using upper bound and lower bound 585 and 100, it was a full distribution, not a single forecast, right, that you could rely on. So when it's about distribution, that uncertainty already comes into the picture with the notion of distribution, right? Second is long horizons and high confidence level. When you're talking about economic capital model, you are talking about something which is for over an year or maybe more, right? Because of the long horizons, because of forecasting over long horizons, it becomes difficult to kind of rely on and make sure everything will be right, because there are multiple assumptions. Severe data scarcity, tail estimation is fragile. Again, you need data, and the data, reliable data is not available. That's where validation becomes hard. And lastly, conceptual soundness tests on untestable assumptions. Like I told you, these are all conceptual models that we had calculated here, right? That this is one conceptual model, this is again conceptual model, right? The aggregation and everything. But who relies on what, you can't say. And most importantly, which is the most accurate ones, nobody knows, right? So these are untestable, but you still have to rely on such models. So this is your complete validation toolkit. How it works is, in the qualitative sense, you use tests, you do a qualitative review, systems implementation, management oversight, all these things you have to look at. You have to do a data quality check, you have to examine the assumptions whatever has been used, do they actually relate to the theory and everything, right? Next is quantitative process. Quantitative validation includes validation of inputs and parameters. Model replication, you try to replicate the complete model and do your own calculations. Then is the benchmarking and hypothetical portfolio testing. There will be back testing, profit and loss attribution, and the stress testing. We'll do each of these in upcoming slides. What say, layering many techniques builds comfort. If you do all of this, that means you have done a comprehensive check. that will give you comfort that this model looks fine, yeah, that everyone has done a check, and there are some really capable people behind it who has done this validation. So that's where your comfort comes from, right? Each test only supports some model properties, that's why you need to do a full validation to completely rely on it. Now one example of this is one example of dependency that they have given. This is your fourth challenge. Now let's go back to the challenges. We have done risk measures, we have done aggregation, we have done validation. Now we have come down to dependency, and for dependency they have taken an example of credit risk, right? So what they are showing is there are some common systematic factors, that is country, industry, region, which are impacting all these obligors. There is obligor A, B, C, D, right? Even though these are four different people or organization, you can say, but there is something which will commonly impact all of these. That's your country risk, industry risk, region risk, correct? So how do you factor in this system, these systematic factors in your calculation, right? So they, why is this hard? That correlations are the crux and they rest heavily on the model assumptions. How do you calculate the correlation among these, right? That to correlation among these in a stress scenario, right? Because stress scenario everything becomes unstable. In normal market you can still calculate, while stress testing things become while taking stress the conditions, things become even more difficult. So how do you incorporate such things in your credit risk model, right? Second is equity derived correlations add noise. Asset equity link can be non-linear. So let's say these are four companies, right? What I try to do is from their equity prices, stock prices, and everything like that movement, I try to derive the correlation, right? And that use that correlation for my credit risk modeling, but that won't be the right way, all right? Because equity correlations are they try to add noise based on other factors, and they are not the true correlation that I am looking for in terms of a credit risk modeling perspective, right? One is debt, one is equity. So like I can use a dummy correlation, equity correlation as a dummy figure, but that won't be the right measure, right? Next is when you talk about ASRF, Gaussian copula, like these are some models you can use to find the correlation, but they are saying that even reliability of these are questioned, right? ASRF, again I'm just trying to remind you, in this chapter you don't need it, but this is asymptotic risk factors. If you recall, fine. If you do not, please go and read, right? So we had done a complete chapter, I think, within credit risk only, asymptotic risk measures, Gaussian copula, right? Normality, all these things we had done in the context of correlations. Lastly, understated PD and the LGD correlation, that is if your PD increases, how much your LGD increase. How do you, like, you can't assume that PD increases in credit risk and LGD does not increase, right? Even if PGD increase, LGD won't increase one on one. That is the example we had done in your old cars market, where PD was increasing in stress scenario but LGD was not increasing to the same level, right? So how do you incorporate all these assumptions in your model? That's dependency modeling, your risk number 4. Fifth is your counterparty risk, right? That's your fifth problem. How now counterparty credit risk, there are two steps to it. First is estimating the exposure, that is PD, LGD, EAD. Second is after estimating these exposure, how do you convert into an actual risk number that you will use for your calculations, right? Now EAD exposure is how much the counterparty will owe at default. We all know what is EAD, right? How much is owed, right? It's mainly market risk driven and from simulated factors. Then is PDLGD. These are credit risk drivers, right? We all know the formulas, we all know how the calculation works. This is the second part that you need for counterparty calculation. Now further, there are two challenges. You have PDLGD, you have EAD. First is your no netting. If you assume, because in a bigger scenario in a bank there are multiple counterparties, right? For multiple counterparties there could be netting, no netting, right? How do you incorporate the assumptions about no netting? If there is no netting across counterparties, the exposure has to be calculated at a netting set level, right? This EAD that you are calculating, you can't simply calculate it at a counterparty level, you have to calculate it at a netting set level. So if with this netting setting set level, you will have to do multiple calculations which will make your model complex. Okay, guys, please try to stay with me. I think it might might sound heavy, right? But just try to relate things on a high level. I'm not asking you to just completely remember each and every chapter of your FRM and then relate with these things. But on a high level, just try to understand how PDLGD and netting these things uh, relate with each other, and how would you balance it here.
Yeah, by the way, Twinkle, sorry for disturbing. The unexpected losses formula, the square root equation, we captured all this loss rate, probability of default. We have captured all this already in credit risk. Unexpected loss
Exactly.
equation, you
Exactly.
know.
That's why. That's why I'm
I'm
telling you. Just
revising that
try to
these
recall it.
days. I'm revising that chapter. That is why I remembered yesterday. I revised that.
Yeah. Recall all it. I'm not expecting you to try modeling in your head and all that. It's just for you to conceptually understand, right? Next is challenge number two, that is long time horizons. That is you can use a single short horizon, and in fact not each exposure is of the same horizon, right? Some loans that you give are for short term horizon, some are for long term horizon. How do you incorporate it all together to calculate your counterparty credit risk, and then incorporate that counterparty credit risk into your economic capital calculations, right? So you can just remember, first point is no netting assumption, second is long horizon assumption. Oh, yeah. Now, the second part of counterparty risk. First part was your calculation EAD, PD, LGD, and your horizons, etc. Second part is you have to bring in your wrong way risk as well, right? When you're talking about counterparty credit risk, you have to talk about your wrong way risk. When wrong way risk means is when you have the exposure towards the other counterparty, like when you have a receivable, that's the time the other party will go under. That's the time their chances of default increase, right? So your exposure rises, right? During the counterparty when the counterparty credit falls, that's what your wrong way risk is. How do you identify and size it in your calculations? That's one complexity, right? Second is your hedge fund opacity, because there are the hedge funds that are there, right? They have multiple investment, that like they are doing multiple things that is not what do you say, that's not known to everyone, right? What How the hedge fund business works, we know, but where they have invested, where they have not invested, what is their investment strategy, nobody would know. So accordingly, if you do not know their investment strategies, etc., only how would you calculate their PD and LGD? Right? So that because they are opaque, their strategies are opaque, it's hard to get to your PD and LGD level and ultimately calculate your counterparty credit risk. Third is margined versus non-margined. Some exposures are margined, right? And they have a short cure period, and some are non-margin names run the life of the trade, right? So again, yeah, so for these margined and non-margined exposures, it is hard to aggregate or mix the two and then calculate your complete picture, right? Lastly is the aggregation, that combining derivatives and security. How the derivatives work and how securities financing work are two different things. Then ultimately, when you're aggregating the two in terms of counterparty credit risk, in as a counterparty exposure or the counterparty measures, it becomes difficult, and again your calculations become more complex. So here, one way to remember is, you are not trying to remember how to resolve it, because that's the difficult part. You are just trying to remember the challenges, that what are the challenges about using these things, and ultimately going to your risk capital. Yeah. Our now fifth part was interest rate risk in banking book. That was your fifth challenge, right? The challenge here is that a long holding period plus intermediate cash flows, because many banking book items carry embedded options. What they are trying to tell you is, we will come down to asset and liability side in a very normal example. Let's say, okay, let's first talk about asset side itself. Let's say you have a house loan, correct? House loan is part of mortgages, are part of your banking book long time horizon, right? Now let's say interest rate change, some interest rate has gone down. What people will do is, they will prepay their loans, correct? High interest loans, and then they will take new loans at lower interest rate, right? So the prepayment assumption, there is prepayment, but you don't know how much prepayments will be there, right? For you to incorporate that prepayment assumption in capital calculations is difficult. That is the challenge basically, because there will be prepayments, the cash flows are uncertain, right? So making the interest rate risk assumptions in the banking book is difficult. That is asset side of things. Same goes with the liability side of things. Now you have liability, means your deposit holders. You are a bank, multiple people have made deposits with you. Now you don't know when everyone will start withdrawing the money, right? Like current economic scenario, where a lot of news have gone out that you should take cash out, banks are not reliable because of the war scenario, blah blah blah. People started taking out cash, right? Now how, as a bank, do you incorporate that assumption in your calculations, that this will be a time where these many people will start taking out cash from the banks, right? So both, and then you have to bring both of these assumptions together and make your and do your banking book calculations. What they're trying to say is, this is difficult to do. That's all you guys have to understand, right? Yeah, next part of it, IRBB, is banks pricing behavior. That is, rate pass through is slow and uneven across products. You like, whatever rate changes you do to different products is not the same, right? So some rates will increase more, some rates will not increase at all. How do you incorporate such assumptions in your stress scenarios? Basically your stress scenarios have to reflect that interaction, but reflecting that itself is difficult, right? So they say, like, you can't simply increase or decrease a shock by 100 200 bps and say, like, and try to do your calculation, because as they said, it is slow and uneven process across the products, right?
Yeah, look at this simple shocks completely ignores changes in slope and curvature. That is such an important point, right? Completely ignores changes in the curvature, changes in the slope.
Yeah, that's where the again, that's where different calculations and the complexity is talked about.
Curvature, so convexity, convexity is completely ignored. That means simple shocks are completely wrong, basically.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So basically, you, even if you try to do simple shocks, that wouldn't do you any good, because you have to change a lot other things to incorporate that change. Yeah, this is a practice question for you guys. Please go through it. Are we good?
Yes, for me.
See, Twinkle, just a small theoretical question. What I have learned is where always fails subadditivity. Here is saying where can fail subadditivity for non-elliptical and skewed loss distributions. So is this true? Can fail subadditivity
Combined
only the
share above the sum of parts is possible and is just one second. Yeah, that's true, right? If your losses are properly distributed, then that where might not fail subadditivity, right?
okay.
Skewness
But
is the
usually
problem, right?
expected shortfall is meeting subadditivity while where does not meet subadditivity. That's what I have learned basically.
Yeah, yeah. In a normal common notion, that's what will work for you as well, right? Question two.
Okay for me.
Okay, anyone else? Guys,
Okay.
last.
That's okay for me also.
Okay. So, now we have done all the challenges about our economic capital frameworks, right? Considering these challenges, we have some recommendations from Bank of International Settlements, right? Which will help supervisors for their internal measures. Obviously, like you have some challenges, regulators will tell you how to kind of go about it, right? What are recommendations? Like first they tell you about use of economic capitals in capital models in capital adequacy. There should be senior management commitment to these models, right? You have to go with transparency and integration into your decisions, whatever, like if you're using capital models, you have to be transparent about it, what you are using out of it, what you are not, what decisions are based on these models, right? So you will talk about risk identification, risk measures, risk aggregation, and validation, right? How all four things are working. Then these are basically your six challenges, like how you are taking care of this six challenges within your the complete model, right? So just one second. Yeah. So that's what BI says. First is use of economic capital models in the capital adequacy. That you have to show how the model feeds real decisions. Right. Basically, you have calculated a capital, economic capital. Fine. How do you making decisions based on that? Right? How you are using the concepts of standalone capital, diversified capital in a real sense. These are not just the numbers to be calculated and kept aside, right? They are calculated for a reason, and for what reason are you using these, right? Second is senior management. Your senior management has to be aligned with everything, right? They have to have a credible buy-in and strong support in your and they have to provide you the infrastructure that is needed for all these work that is going on in behind calculating the economic capital, right? Third is transparency and integration, that the results must be traceable and used. It can't be a black box kind of calculation where you just calculate some numbers and you keep it. You have to know what kind of models have you used, how did you um, uh, how did you increase sorry aggregate it at the firm level, what kind of stress tests you have used, all of that, your documentation has to be there. Fourth is risk identification, that you have to capture the right drivers. You can't you know that what they're saying is handle hard to quantify risks with sensitivity, stress, and scenario analysis. There could be some hard to quantify risks. What do you do about that? When you are, even when you are capturing risks, you can't if you have done that, I'm not sure if it is going to go come in upcoming chapters. There is a concept that you can't capture each and every risk as well, right? If what's the marginal buy-in of that risk. Let's say some activity is use only impacting very less, then you can't capture that kind of activity in your risk calculation, right? It's just making your calculations more complex. So that's where you have to capture the right drivers and have to handle those. That's the important bit. Next is risk measure. No single risk measure is perfect. Understands the limit of chosen risk measure. When you are saying I have used standard deviation, I have used var, es, whatever you are using, you have to use the correct. It's not about the correct measure. It's about like you understanding what are the limitations of those measure. You can use var, you can use es or anything. Just make sure like you understand what are the implications of using that measure. Sixth is risk aggregation. That is, aggregation quality depends on the components and their interactions. Of course, we have already done six aggregation, I think five or six aggregation methodologies, right? So again, you have to BI says that aggregation quality will also depend on different components and their interactions, right? So you can't go overboard with such calculations, right? You have to and you can't go over simplistic or over complex. You have to use a right mix of things. Seventh is validation. Like you have done every calculation, fine, you have created a model, but your model has to be rigorously validated across all the assumptions, confidence levels, horizons, and everything. You have to make sure your model, whatever assumptions etc that you have used, they are validated and they are right ones to be used, right? Eighth is dependency modeling in credit risk. Again, these are all challenges that BIS is highlighting, that you have to make sure you surpass these challenges or you deal with these challenges, right? For dependency modeling, you have to assess whether the dependency structure suit the portfolio. Whatever dependency structure that you have created, is it suiting the complete portfolio? Does it address the limits with any supplementary method that you can use, right? Again, with counterparty credit risk, you have to understand the trade-offs between different methods. Like whatever method you are using to you calculate counterparty credit risk, you have to understand this. You have to supplement it with your stress testing, overall. Lastly, interest rate risk in banking board. That is, you have to examine the embedded options closely. When you say embedded options, that is the about the prepayment option, and deposit holders taking out their money. All these are the embedded options, right? You have to recognize the earning versus economic value trade off between all the things, right? So that's what BI says. Please go through this question. So I hope you recall where we left this chapter last time, about the basically we were discussing about economic capital. We were discussing about different risk measures, as well as RAROC, as calculations and everything. That's what we had discussed, right? And just one second, if I go up a little, mainly we left it at the 10 BIS recommendations in terms of economic capital, right? So, continuing from the same, now we have economic capital at the business level. Basically, how you have created a measure, that's fine, but how do you use that measure for your, you know, business activities? In the sense that, okay, I have RAROC. How do I make decisions using that? Because otherwise, if it is in silo, there is no point having such a measure, right? So they have taken four areas where you see the utility, that's credit portfolio management, risk based pricing, customer profitability analysis, and management incentives, right? What they say is, within these, what is the RAROC intuition is that expected loss is already built into the price. We all know that, we have done it multiple times till now, right? Your economic capital comes from your unexpected loss, right? So economic capital sets the return shareholders need. Right?
Hi, good morning, Twinkle. Good morning. Sorry for disturbing you. So,
Yeah.
I have worked about 3 decades in banking. So, I know firsthand this RAROC calculation. There's a separate Excel sheet with the credit proposal. And we really break our head, and our bosses really pressurize us to get a positive RAROC. Sometimes we manipulate the figures a little bit. It's a proper detailed Excel file. So, and we
Hmm.
manipulate the figures, give a good RAROC, and we attach that with the credit proposal. So the very first
Sorry,
thing
the RROC figures what? I didn't get you.
there's a special Excel file, special Excel sheet with a lot of macros and everything. Okay, so
Right.
we feed the numbers. We and our bosses, we break a lot of our heads and take a lot of stress for this. So we want to give always a very rosy RAROC, and then we put that sheet on top of the credit proposal. So when the credit committee looks at the proposal, one of the
Mm-hmm.
key things they look at is this RAROC calculation. So a lot of
Right.
some manipulation also happens. We try to make the figure a little rosy. That's how it is. That's
Yeah.
my experience has been lot of stress for this RAROC calculation actually.
Right. See, that's the whole point of having such a measure, right? Otherwise, banks could be easily using your return on equity, return on income, return on capital, all those, right? That's the whole point of using these, going a little further and using such calculations, because you want to rely on like this is a basically reliable measure in terms of it incorporates the risk, right? That's where the sophistication comes from, right? So that's what we are going to do. Like, you have calculated RAROC, right? But where is it being utilized after calculation? So yeah. And one point that we all know is a deal is only accepted if RAROC clears a hurdle rate. If it is over and above some minimal number that has been decided, right? So let's get right into it. First is your credit portfolio management. That's the first part we did. So if we understand about credit portfolio management, what we say is like how it means is, let's say you have two portfolios, portfolio A and portfolio B, and let's say portfolio A earns $10 million and B earns $8 million. So looking at only the earning point, right? What we will think is portfolio A is better than portfolio B, right? But when we look at it from a RAROC standpoint, we will also look into how much capital A needs and how much capital B needs, right? Because with the risk, you need to put aside some capital. So let's say A was earning $10 million, but for that, but for the same project, you needed a capital of $200 million. But at the same time, B, which is earning $8 million, but the capital that you need to put aside for that is only say $100 million. So the difference is relativity here, right? So relatively per unit capital needed by B is lesser than A. That's where you will do you will take a conscious decision that in reality B is better than A, right? So you understood my point, right? So you have two portfolios where where RAROC helps you decide which portfolio is better, not only based on the return that you are generating from that portfolio, but also the risk incorporated in that portfolio, right? So what it says is, what are the impacts or constraints that the borrower quality is judged in a portfolio context, not standalone, right? You will in a portfolio context, you will see which is better, which is not. A loan marginal contribution drives portfolio concentration. We have already done the measures on marginal contribution in the last chapter, I guess. So that's where they are coming at. Some of the benefits or opportunities here is guides which hedges to use to cut the concentration. Like, what kind of hedging strategies do you the bank should use so that risk is not concentrated, and secondly becomes a tool to protect against credit quality deterioration. Again, these are the risk parts, is what they are mentioning here. Next is risk based pricing. That's the second part where RAROC is used. So what they say is like we all know that a deal below the threshold is rejected. That's your hurdle rate, right? And the allocated economic capital sets the minimum rate. So what are your price general price components? These are cost of funding, expected loss, allocated economic capital, and additional return required by the shareholders. These are generally the any while pricing any products, these are your components. So what happens is, within risk based pricing, what you do is, let's say you have two customers, right? And for both the customers, um, one is less risky, other is high risk customer, but you are charging the same interest rate to both, right? If you're charging same interest rate to both, then that's not really beneficial for the bank, right? If one is giving you high risk, other is giving you low risk, then you should that's where risk based pricing comes in, that you will also charge based on their risk factors. That's what RAROC helps you decide, like economic capital needed for customer B is greater than economic capital needed for customer A. That's why you should charge a high rate to customer B than you should charge to A, right? That's the another decisioning, another utility of RAROC. So what are the impacts? That a minimum rate that protects the shareholder value is set, that is there, your hurdle rate is already there. Next is the prices can be overridden for relationship or reputation reasons. That's an important point, right? So this is sometimes you override the prices that are given by RAROC numbers. Why that happens is, let's say you have a customer which which is a very in the sense the relationship is a very long term relationship, where they have been using your bank's products for quite some time now, and they are using multiple products, right? So what sometimes bank will do is that, okay, in this is a big corporate, I am doing their salaries, I am doing their transfers to their vendors, to their customers, taking the transfers from their customers, blah blah blah. So if at one point, like let's say if I have to give some favorable conditions to these customers, or some product where bank might not be the earning the best, which it could earn from other customers, they'll still give off that product. Why? Because of the relationship that is there with that customer, right? So yes, your RAROC, all your quantitative things are there, but that's where somewhere you can override your RAROC calculations, right? So it needs these such overrides would need obviously senior approval and close monitoring, right? Guys, sorry, just give me a second please. I'm so sorry. My screen is visible, right?
Yes.
Okay. So then is the they have given an example of RAROC pricing. Let's say there is a Pragati commercial bank where is commercial Pragati commercial bank is pricing new 200 crore term loan to manufacturing client, right? The risk team supplies the figures below, compute the RAROC, and decide whether the deal clears the bank's hurdle rate of 15%. They have already given us the hurdle rate. Now, what is provided to us? That is annual revenue of 18 crore, right? Out of which your expected loss is 3 crores, operating cost is 2 crores, economic capital allocated to this loan is 80 crores, and your hurdle rate is 15%. Anyone would like to do the calculations here? Do you want to do you guys I think this is a pretty simple calculation, we have all done RAROC. Do you want to try it at your end? I have done it at my end, I am sorted with my calculations. Do you guys want to give me the numbers?
Yeah, it's okay to do 16.25. So we can do it. Better than hurdle rate.
Okay, anyone else?
16.25. Yeah.
So yeah, so one good thing is all of you are able to incorporate the numbers in the calculations, right? So yeah, that's your RAROC. That's 16.25, which is greater than your hurdle rate, and ultimately the conclusion would be to accept the deal, right? uh, so one thing to notice here is that the economic capital sits in the denominator, right? So a riskier the loan needs more capital and a high return to clear the same hurdle rate. Like, this is a relative number that you can say. So, yeah, moving forward, next is we have done four utility cases. We have done risk based pricing, we have done credit portfolio management. The next part is the customer profitability analysis. Right, that's where your RAROC comes into play as well. Yeah. The when you discuss the impacts of the constraints here, the many risks must be aggregated at the customer level, right? Like, you do different analysis at different levels, portfolio levels, customer levels, right? All that you do. When you do try to analyze things at the customer level, obviously it is hard to do the analysis, because different customers, different risk profiles, and how do you compare things. All these, but like, these are the some of the hurdles you face while using RAROC for customer profitability analysis. The benefits here is the opportunities here are that identifies the unprofitable or marginal customers. When you say unprofitable, that the customers who are not contributing, right? Or marginal customers, again, this comes from the calculation where we had done standalone, marginal, all those calculations, right? I think the last chapter through this, where you see, like, if this is the total return of your portfolio, and then you add a customer, does your profit increase, decrease, right? And how much does it impact? So that's where your marginal analysis comes in. Reallocates capital to more profitable relationship. Obviously, like, if you see relatively this customer will get you more return, you will do your reallocate your capital towards that customer, and obviously optimizes the risk return trade off. Right. Here also, like, the intuition is same. You have, let's say, two customers, both are earning the same, right? But you one is using less capital, other is using more capital. Then relatively you will all obviously pick the one which is using lesser capital, right? Because now the extra money you can use it for other business or some other strategy. Got it. So by customer profitability analysis, what we mean is, you try to understand which customer is creating more value per unit risk, or the per unit economic capital that they are using. Lastly is the management incentives. One of the most important points, we can say. uh, so here, sorry. The When you look at the impacts of the constraint, the main constraint is the compensation schemes rank low among the actual uses of economic capital at the business unit level. Just give me 1 second. So yeah, when you look at the compensation scheme currently, like, you don't see the like, how do you use economic capital for those compensation schemes, right? One intuitive way to think about it is that, you see, let's say there are two managers, both managers are investing or doing some part of their business, right? So you won't only look at the revenue those managers have generated, right? You like, uh, let's say there is A and B, right? Both are part of trading unit. let's say A is earning 20% return, but B is earning only 15% return. Looking at just the return part, I can say A is more profitable. But is that really what we want to do? No, right? Might also be using more capital. A might also be doing more riskier investments, which in initially might sound high return, highly profitable or providing high return, but during the stressful scenarios that might not last, right? So that's where they say that you use RAROC as a measure to understand the performance of your these portfolio managers, etc. And accordingly, basically like this relative riskiness or the use of economic capital, you can provide incentives to these managers, right? So if the your incentive scheme is only based on the return you generate, then obviously in within our example of A and B as well, A will get more incentives, right? But at the same time, if I base my incentives on the risk adjusted return, that A is using more capital, B is using less capital, then it might happen that I'll say that B should get more incentives, because B has taken into account not only the return it is generating, but it has also taken into the account what is how much capital is being utilized, right? What is the risk appetite of the bank? So that's how you segregate the two. Hope it is clear. Okay, I'll take it as a yes. You guys want to go through the question? Let me know once done.
This is good.
Good. Anyone, any doubts? Okay. Please go through this as well. This is, I think, very normal, right? You guys done?
Done.
So next part is governance. See, any chapter of your risk, right? Or in fact the operation risk mainly, I think in credit risk as well, one important point is governance, right? Wherever you discuss any model or any framework, governance is the basis of it, right? You have made the RAROC model, fine, but who is governing it, right? Who is setting standards, policies, and who is assigning responsibilities? That's the complete part of your governance. Like I think I have already highlighted it enough, but wherever the governance bit comes into play, right, these are the things that you think about: people, processes, and your systems. So, what an effective framework needs is strong controls for changing risk measurement, right? Your comprehensive documentation of methods and allocation, who gets what, right? Who does what, and what's everyone's responsibility, right? Policies that keep the practice within procedure, because if there is no policy, what are you even following? That's also under the purview of your governance and real use in day-to-day business decisions. So why governance matters is it is the governance is what makes the numbers trustworthy, because I know these numbers are generated based on a policy, a framework, and so these numbers also won't change every time. In the sense, like this time these type of calculations looked favorable, next time you change things and make calculations look favorable in another way. no point doing that, right? So it is increasingly important as economic capital moves from relative use to setting absolute capital. When you say relative use to absolute capital, relative use simply means your ratios, right? Risk return ratios, to setting absolute capital, where you keep separate a dollar amount in terms of capital. That's the move you make in terms of using your economic capital or calculating it, right? So four best practices in terms of governance are, just one second. First is senior management commitment. That is obviously, even if you whenever you are calculating economic capital or using RAROC as your performance measurements, etc., you need your senior management commitment. That is, you can't do things in silos. Successful implementation depends on the involvement and experience of senior management. One part here is, we all do is, board of directors are the one who kind of overlooks everything. They will they are not the ones who are implementing anything, any framework, any model. Implementation does not come from board of directors. They just overlook as to what is happening. When it comes to senior management, that's where your part comes in. This is a general a general thing that you will follow across your FRM syllabus. Okay, now coming to this particular part, that is implementation of your RAROC framework depends on the involvement and experience of senior management. Obviously, if they don't understand the use, right? If they don't understand what is economic capital, or how it is to be calculated, or what things to be incorporated, and that too we are talking about at a bank level, not at a small, each business unit. Like, you need obviously at a business unit level, as well as at the bank level, but senior management needs to understand the repercussions of each and everything. Only then your model will be successfully implemented, right? Next is your business unit and its expertise. So senior management is looking at the overall level, right? They are looking at the interactions among business units, but within a business unit, there also responsibilities change, as in from centralized to decentralized across risk and finance. Like, how do you for the example, treasury teams, your calculations might be more centralized. At one point, the things might could be calculated, but it could be among other teams, say risk and finance. Whatever your economic capital calculations that you're doing, those could be decentralized, right? So that also depends on what kind of framework you use and which works best for what. uh, right. Next is your timing of measurement and disclosure. Like, how often do you do the calculations? For example, like most banks using calculate economic capital monthly or quarterly, whereas and pillar 3 obviously encourages the disclosure, we all know that. So that's your timing of your calculation also makes a part of your governance model. Lastly, policies and procedures, that is your written policies, your formal rules of who does what, where does your validation stands, which team does that, who is the monitoring, and if you are monitoring that model, like what are the checks you are performing. Are you performing those checks monthly, yearly, quarterly? How does that happen? So these are all the things that you are looking at when implementing the model. Now, within this, there are six key concerns. First is the senior management commitment. That is, buy-in drives how meaningful the process is. If your senior management is not committed to the whole economic capital process, let's say they are only worried about the profitability, they do not care about the risk, then there is no point having RAROC, right? Do you all agree?
Yes.
Okay, if there is a confusion in this, I can explain. Anyone? But the point is, like, if I am ultimately only concerned with how much I am earning, then there is no point of having risk adjusted returns and all that, doing all those calculations, because then I won't be looking at the risk at all, right? That's why it's not that the risk team is bringing all these models and calculations and doing risk adjusted this, not only RAROC, but within this chapter we had done other measure as well, right?
Hi,
ROI.
Twinkle. Sorry for disturbing. Small question. Here, you are saying defining available capital. Most people are just tier one. Here it says no common definition. But I thought tier one is the definition, right? What is no common definition? What does it mean?
With the among banks there have to be, like, when you say mm, uh, available capital, right? What do you call as available capital?
Tier one is
Most.
typically ordinary shares plus preference shares, basically. Ordinary
Yes,
shares fully
common
paid
shares
up,
plus preferred shares.
fully prefer. Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
but along with that, then you
But
have
all
your
the
tier 2,
convertible
tier 3
bonds,
also available, right?
all convertible bonds and debentures are typically tier two. Am I correct? Convertible bonds and debentures are tier two,
Yeah,
basically.
and then your goodwill part also comes into play.
Yes.
So, like, even when you, I think the cash is also tier 1, if I'm not wrong. So,
Yes, yes.
uh, like, that's the definition, right? If you say there is, like, what do you call as, what do you consider as capital? Which parts do you consider as capital? That's the question, right? Are you getting it?
Yeah, it's okay. Just okay. I want to know what this no common definition means. That's why.
Mm, yeah, let me go through each of these points and I'll come to this again. Okay. So yeah, we were discussing about the senior management buy-in. That is, like, uh, uh, it's economic capital calculation is only useful if your senior management uses it in terms of their decision making, right? Next part is role of stress testing. What this is, only having economic capital is not done. Like, that's not all. You need to stress test it as well. And so you have calculated economic capital, fine. Right, you have used a confidence level, you say, like, at 99% or at 99.9%, this is my economic capital, and all that. And then but you need to also stress test it, right? Like, if any contingency comes in, then what will happen to my economic capital? Right, during maybe recessions or liquidity squeeze, all those things. One part here is integrated stress test. That means, when you calculate economic capital at, say, business unit levels or product levels, etc., how do you integrate that stress test across the overall economic capital, right? That is, you don't want to stress the different risks separately, you want to do it all at the same time, that is market, credit, etc. This is one utility we had done in last chapter as well, where we were looking at that risk is fine, how do you aggregate the risks at different levels? That's exactly what we are doing here. So this is one of other concerns in terms of calculating your economic capital, right? Next is absolute versus relative. That the interpretation depends on which basis is being used, absolute or relative. um so when you look at when you say, like, where to use what measure, are we using the absolute measure, or we should use relative measures? How do you look at it is, that is, if you want to calculate how much capital does a bank need, right? Like, how much do you want to set aside? That's where your absolute picture comes in, right? Where you have given a dollar amount, that say $100 million, $50 million, or whatever. That's the absolute number that we are coming forward with. When you look, say, relative view, a relative view comes into picture when you compare two projects or two portfolios or something of that sort, or two business units, let's say. That's where you use the relative measure, in the sense that this is earning so much relative to the capital relative to the capital it is using. So for the portfolio comparison purposes, you use the relative measure. So this will, based on the absolute value or the relative value, your interpretation also changes. So ultimately, the same economic capital could have different uses, right? Next part is, it's not the sole determinant. Banks also align capital with the external ratings. Let's say, what they mean is, when you assign economic capital, right, or calculate capital, economic capital, you do not do it only based on your internal models, right? You also have to consider your regulatory capital. That is, we all know, right? You compare if economic capital is higher or regulatory capital is higher, and then accordingly you keep the one which is higher, right? You also try to compare it with your internal, external ratings, right, market interpretations, etc. So internal economic capital model says, let's say, internal model says that you have, you need a capital of x amount, right? But as per external ratings, your bank looks more risky, then you might need to increase that capital level. So that's another challenge when you are looking into calculation of economic capital. Next point is defining a available capital. That is, how do you compare your available capital versus the economic capital that you have, right? um uh, when you say, available capital, you start, mainly with your tier 1 capital, right? How much is available within the bank, and how much is needed, and which part, when you you this much is, economic capital is needed, say $100 million, but how do you bring that in, right? So you make adjustments to your available capital, add more money, or do stuff with it, and that's where things change, right? And there is basically no common definition of available capital. So if there is bank A and there is bank B, they both might have their own definitions of how do they come up with the capital available within their banks, right? That's the concern. Lastly is the transparency. That is, transparent models are more useful to managers. What they mean to say is, like when you are calculating economic capital, right? Or any model for that matter, if you make the more complicated the model you make, it might look more sophisticated, but that can't be understood by everyone, right? So it's good to make your model less accurate, but more understandable, right? Because then, if it is understandable, you know where things are going wrong, or what things need to be changed to make it, to get your work done, right? So that's the challenge. Like, do not keep on adding multiple risk factors, more and more risk factors, just to make your model more accurate. Okay. Yeah, next we have a question. Do you want to go through it? Let me know once done.
Yeah.
Okay. This is where, please. Done.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is just the takeaways from this chapter. That is, first is six challenge areas that we had discussed. That is measuring, basically identification, then measuring aggregation, validation, and dependency on counterparty risk. These are all basically in terms of your risk measures, which risk measures to use, and how to use that, right? Next was 10 BIS risk recommendations that are given by supervisors, right? For internal measures that to calculate your economic capital. Third is your business units, that is credit portfolio management, RAROC pricing, customer profitability, and incentives. And these are all basically your use cases of economic capital. And lastly, the governance, right? Anyone, any questions about this chapter?
This is a very important chapter to be revised for years to come. Very important chapter.
Yeah. See, the only thing is, for chapters like these could be overwhelming. Today, it might not look like so because we were left only with the small portion of it. One thing I would ask, like if you want to keep it in your memory, just go with how you read it is. Go through the learning objectives, go through the end of chapter notes in your Schweizer books and your GAR books, and even in this way, like we have key takeaway, right? Go through those first, because that will help you make a that will help you understand what is coming in the chapter, right? What's the point of reading each and every line? Then once you go through the complete content, it will help things set in your brain. That's all I can suggest, right?